Imagine going to sleep in a world that makes sense. You live in a great city with towering palaces, busy markets, and ships arriving daily from distant lands. There are laws, trade routes, writing, art, and diplomacy. Your civilization has stood for centuries. Your grandparents lived in this city, and you expect your grandchildren will too. The world feels permanent, solid, eternal. Now imagine waking up 50 years later. The palaces are burned, the markets are empty, the ships don't come anymore, the trade routes have gone silent. Cities that held tens of thousands now shelter a few hundred survivors picking through ruins. The writing systems your scribes spent lifetimes mastering, forgotten, the art destroyed, the diplomacy irrelevant because there's nobody left to negotiate with. This isn't a hypothetical. This actually happened. Around 1177 BC, within the span of a single human lifetime, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Not one or two, almost all of them, at once. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for centuries, simply vanished. The Mycenaean Greeks, the real people behind the legends of Agamemnon and Achilles, their palace civilization was utterly destroyed. The mighty city of Ugarit, a cosmopolitan hub of international trade, burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. The Assyrians retreated behind their walls. The Cypriots abandoned their cities. Even Egypt, the oldest and most stable civilization in the ancient world, barely survived, crippled and diminished. Within 50 years, the entire interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age was gone, replaced by what historians call the Dark Age, centuries where populations plummeted, literacy disappeared, and the archaeological record goes almost silent. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what it's for. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is there. I love checking comments and seeing Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, all experiencing the same mystery together across time zones. Here's what makes the Bronze Age collapse so haunting. These weren't primitive societies vulnerable to any disruption. These were the superpowers of their age. The Egyptians had survived for over 2,000 years through droughts, famines, invasions, and internal rebellions. They had professional armies, vast grain reserves, and a bureaucracy that could mobilize the resources of an entire nation. The Hittites controlled Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, with a sophisticated empire complete with vassal kingdoms, treaty systems, and diplomatic marriages connecting them to every major power. The Mycenaeans had fortified their palaces with walls so massive that later Greeks believed they'd been built by giants. And yet something brought them all down. Something so catastrophic, so overwhelming, that it didn't just defeat these civilizations, it erased them. That's the mystery that's haunted archaeologists for over a century. What could possibly destroy multiple powerful empires simultaneously? Empires that were hundreds or thousands of miles apart. Empires with different cultures, different languages, different gods, different military strategies. What kind of disaster doesn't respect borders, doesn't discriminate between the powerful and the weak, and doesn't leave survivors who can rebuild? The evidence is written in ash layers and destruction debris at site after site across the eastern Mediterranean. Palaces burned, cities abandoned. Trade goods that travelled thousands of miles suddenly stop appearing in the archaeological record. Letters between kings go unanswered, then stop being written altogether. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses III described battles against mysterious invaders he called the Sea Peoples, enemies who came by land and sea, destroying everything in their path. But who were the Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? And more importantly, were they the cause of the collapse or just another symptom of something even bigger? For decades, scholars have debated what happened in those catastrophic years around 1137 BC. Was it invasion, climate change, earthquake storms, economic collapse, internal rebellion, and here's the truly unsettling part. It might have been all of them at once. A perfect storm of disasters that the Bronze Age world, for all its sophistication and power, simply couldn't survive. What makes this collapse different from other historical catastrophes is the totality of it. When Rome fell, Byzantine civilization continued. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the eastern half thrived for another 1,000 years. But when the Bronze Age world fell, it took almost everything with it. Technologies were lost. Trade networks that had connected 3 continents for centuries simply ceased to exist. In Greece, people forgot how to write. Not how to write well, how to write at all, for 400 years. Think about that. An entire civilization forgetting literacy, going from palace bureaucracies that recorded everything, every jar of oil, every diplomatic gift, every military campaign, to nothing. Silence. This is the story of that collapse, how the Bronze Age world built itself into something magnificent and interconnected and seemingly unstoppable, and then how it all came crashing down in what might be the greatest catastrophe in human history before the modern era. We'll walk through the glittering cities before the fall, meet the people who lived through the collapse, and examine the evidence they left behind in ruins and desperate letters, and the archaeological record of destruction. And we'll ask the question that still echoes across 3,000 years. Could it happen again? Picture this. It's 1250 BC, and you're standing on a hilltop overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Below you, the harbour is packed with ships, Egyptian vessels with their distinctive curved hulls and single square sails, Mycenaean galleys, bristling with oars, Cypriot merchant ships sitting low in the water, heavy with copper ingots, ships from places whose names we've barely recovered, Ugarit, Tyre, Byblos, carrying goods that have travelled thousands of miles through networks so sophisticated they won't be matched again for over 1,000 years. This isn't just trade. This is the culmination of 300 years of unprecedented international cooperation. The Late Bronze Age isn't just another period of ancient history. It's humanity's first attempt at creating a truly interconnected world system. And for a brief glittering moment, it actually worked. The Late Bronze Age, roughly 1500 to 1200 BC, represents something that hadn't existed before and wouldn't exist again for millennia. A world of multiple powerful civilizations, each strong enough to stand independently, but all choosing to participate in a shared system of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. It was complicated, fragile, and utterly dependent on every piece functioning correctly, which, as we'll see, was exactly the problem. But before we get to how it all fell apart, we need to understand just how magnificent this world was, how much was at stake, how far humanity had climbed, which makes the fall all the more devastating. Let's start with the superpower everyone knows, Egypt. But forget the Egypt of the pyramid builders, that was ancient history even to the people of the Late Bronze Age. The Egypt of 1250 BC was something else entirely. This was Egypt at the absolute peak of its power, the new kingdom, the age of empire. And the man who embodied this golden age more than anyone was Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great. Ramesses ruled for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BC. Think about that. 66 years. Most Bronze Age rulers were lucky to reign for a decade before war, disease, or palace intrigue cut them down. But Ramesses kept going, kept building, kept projecting Egyptian power across the known world until he died somewhere in his 90s, impossibly old for the ancient world, and he made sure everyone knew about it. Ramesses was history's first master of propaganda. Every temple, every statue, every inscription screamed his name and his achievements. He built more monuments than any other pharaoh. Abu Simbel, Those massive temples carved directly into cliff faces with 4 colossal statues of Ramesses himself staring out across the Nile. The additions to Karnak and Luxor temples, turning them into the largest religious complexes in the ancient world. The Ramesseum, his massive mortuary temple designed to ensure his cult would be maintained for eternity. But this wasn't just vanity. Okay, it was partly vanity. The man definitely had an ego. But it was also a demonstration of something more fundamental. Egypt's ability to command enormous resources and organize them into projects that left everyone else in awe. To carve Abu Simbel, you need thousands of skilled workers. You need to feed them, house them, and keep them working in brutal heat for years. You need the administrative apparatus to organize this effort. You need the economic surplus to divert that much labor away from agriculture. You need the political stability to maintain such projects across decades. Egypt had all of this. Its wealth came from the Nile, that miracle of nature that flooded like clockwork every year, depositing nutrient-rich silt that made the Nile Valley the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. While other civilizations worried about droughts and crop failures, Egypt's granaries overflowed. That surplus supported a vast bureaucracy of scribes, priests, and officials. It fed armies that could march into Asia or south into Nubia. It allowed Egypt to dominate the gold trade, controlling the mines of Nubia that produced more gold than anywhere else in the Bronze Age world. But Ramesses wasn't just building monuments. He was also fighting wars, most famously at Kadesh in 1274 BC, probably the largest chariot battle in history. Ramesses led an army of perhaps 20,000 men deep into Syria to confront the Hittites, Egypt's only real rival for dominance of the eastern Mediterranean. The battle was actually pretty chaotic. Ramesses got himself surrounded and nearly captured through what was either strategic brilliance by the Hittites or just poor reconnaissance on Egypt's part. But he fought his way out, and more importantly, he declared it a great victory. Was it? Probably not. At best, it was a draw. The Hittites kept control of Kadesh, but what matters is what happened next. 16 years later, in 1258 BC, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed history's first recorded peace treaty. Not just a temporary truce, but a formal alliance with specific terms, territorial boundaries, and mutual defense agreements. We have copies of this treaty in both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Hittite cuneiform. It's now in the United Nations building in New York as a symbol of international diplomacy. This treaty created stability. With Egypt and the Hittites no longer fighting, the entire eastern Mediterranean settled into a period of remarkable peace. Trade flourished, cities grew wealthy, culture bloomed. This is what historians mean when they talk about the late Bronze Age international system. Not just trade, but actual diplomacy, negotiated settlements, a framework for managing conflict without constant warfare. The Hittites were the other superpower of this world, though they're less familiar to most people today. Their empire was centered in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, with their capital at Hattusa, a massive fortress city in the Central Highlands. The Hittites were relative newcomers to imperial power. They'd risen to prominence around 1650 BC and spent centuries fighting their way to the top. But by the late Bronze Age, they'd become masters of two things that kept them competitive with Egypt's wealth and manpower. First, diplomacy. The Hittite archives at Hattusa have given us thousands of clay tablets, and many of them are letters between Hittite kings and Egyptian pharaohs, addressing each other as brothers, letters to and from the kings of Babylon, Assyria, and smaller kingdoms, letters arranging diplomatic marriages, negotiating trade agreements, settling disputes over refugees or stolen property. The Hittites understood that empires could be maintained through negotiation as well as conquest. They used diplomatic marriages brilliantly, wedding Hittite princesses to foreign kings to cement alliances. Second, they were technological innovators. The Hittites were among the first to master ironworking, though they kept the technology carefully guarded. Bronze Age empires ran on bronze, obviously that alloy of copper and tin that gave the era its name. But iron was stronger, held an edge better, and most importantly, iron ore was far more common than tin. The civilization that could mass-produce iron weapons would have a decisive military advantage. The Hittites weren't quite there yet. Iron was still rare and expensive, used for ceremonial objects more than weapons. But they were learning, experimenting, getting closer. It was one of their few advantages against Egypt's overwhelming wealth. The Hittite military was built around the chariot, just like Egypt's, but they used heavier 3-man chariots compared to Egypt's lighter 2-man versions. Driver, warrior, and shield bearer working as a coordinated unit. At Kadesh, the Hittites deployed perhaps 2,500 chariots, the largest concentration of armoured vehicles the world had ever seen. The thunder of their approach must have been terrifying. Thousands of horses, hundreds of wooden wheels, all bearing down at speeds that no infantry could match. But the Hittites' greatest strength was also their weakness. Their empire was scattered, stretching from the Aegean coast in the west to Syria in the south to the approaches of Mesopotamia in the east. This meant constant border conflicts, endless small wars with neighbours, perpetual rebellion by subject peoples. The Hittite king couldn't afford to relax. Every spring brought new military campaigns. Every winter brought reports of new threats. The empire required constant attention to hold together. Now look west, across the Aegean Sea to Greece. This is the world that would later inspire Homer's epics, though Homer wrote his poems 400 years after the civilization he described had vanished. The Mycenaean civilization, named after Mycenae, the most powerful of the Greek palatial centres. The Mycenaeans weren't a unified empire. They were a collection of independent kingdoms, each centred on a massive fortified palace. Mycenae, ruled by the family that tradition said produced Agamemnon. Pylos in the southwest, whose Linear B tablets give us detailed records of Bronze Age administration. Tiryns with its Cyclopean walls. Thebes. Athens, though it was just one centre among many at this point, not the dominant city it would become centuries later. These weren't the classical Greeks who would later develop philosophy and democracy. The Mycenaeans were warrior kings ruling from palace fortresses, commanding societies organised for war and trade. Their palaces were administrative centres that controlled every aspect of the economy. We know this because they left records in Linear B, an early form of Greek that wasn't deciphered until 1952. And these records are fascinating. They're not literature or history. They're inventories, tax records, and administrative notes. Lists of bronze weapons stored in palace armories, records of textile production quotas for different workshops, distributions of grain rations to workers, counts of sheep and goats controlled by the palace. This was a command economy, centralized and bureaucratic. The palace owned or controlled vast resources. It organized production, collected taxes, and redistributed goods. It employed specialized craftsmen, perfume makers, weaponsmiths, chariot builders, gold workers. It maintained fleets of ships for trade and warfare. It mobilized armies for conquest or defense. But the Mycenaeans were also traders, sending their distinctive pottery across the Mediterranean. Mycenaean pots show up in Egypt, Cyprus, the Levant, and throughout the Aegean. They were looking for metals, especially tin for bronze production, since Greece didn't have local tin sources. They traded olive oil, wine, and manufactured goods for the raw materials their civilization needed. The archaeology shows us a culture obsessed with warfare and status. Mycenaean elite burials contain magnificent weapons, gold death masks, and bronze armour. Their palace walls are covered with frescoes showing military parades, boar hunts, and combat. This was a society where warrior prowess defined your place in the hierarchy. Later Greek legends about heroes like Achilles and Ajax probably preserve some memory of this warrior culture, even if the specific stories were invented or heavily embellished. And if you believe the legends, around 1250 BC, these Mycenaean kingdoms united for the greatest military expedition of the Bronze Age, the Trojan War. Did it really happen? That's debated. There was definitely a city at Troy, and it was definitely destroyed by warfare around 1200 BC. Whether this was actually a massive Greek expedition, or just local warfare that later got embellished into an epic, we can't say for certain. But the fact that the legend persisted suggests that Mycenaean Greece was capable of organising major overseas military campaigns. Now shift east to Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. This is where civilization itself had begun, where the world's first cities rose 3,000 years before our Bronze Age peak. By 1250 BC, Mesopotamia was divided between several powers, none quite as dominant as Egypt or the Hittites, but all major players in the international system. Babylon in the south was ancient even then, a city with over 1,000 years of history. The Babylon of this era was wealthy and cultured, controlled by the Kassite dynasty. Babylonian scribes were the intellectuals of the Bronze Age world, preserving and developing astronomy, mathematics, and literature. The Babylonian language was the diplomatic lingua franca. Even Egyptian pharaohs and Hittite kings wrote to each other in Babylonian cuneiform. Further north, Assyria was rising. The Middle Assyrian period saw Assyria transform from a regional power into something more threatening. Assyrian kings were aggressively expansionist, pushing west toward the Mediterranean and south into Babylonia. Their military was becoming the most feared in the Near East, pioneering siege warfare techniques and systematic brutality against conquered peoples. But they weren't yet the empire they'd become. That was still a few centuries away. For now, they were just one more power competing for resources and territory. Between these major empires lay dozens of smaller kingdoms and city-states, each playing their own delicate political game. The Levantine coast, modern-day Syria, Lebanon and Israel, was a patchwork of city-states, each controlling a small territory, but punching above its weight through trade and diplomacy. Ugarit was perhaps the most prosperous. A major port city, it sat at the crossroads of trade routes connecting Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. Ships from across the known world crowded its harbours. Its merchants grew fabulously wealthy facilitating this trade. Its scribes developed one of the first alphabetic writing systems, far simpler than the complex hieroglyphics or cuneiform that required years of training to master. Nearby were the Phoenician cities, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, though they weren't called Phoenician yet. That name would come later. These were independent city-states that would later become famous as the greatest sailors and merchants of antiquity. But in the late Bronze Age, they were still developing the maritime skills that would define them. And then there was Cyprus, the island that might have been the most crucial piece of the whole system. Cyprus was covered with copper mines. The very name Cyprus probably derives from the Greek word for copper. In a Bronze Age, you need copper, it's half of bronze, and Cyprus supplied enormous quantities of it, distributed across the Mediterranean in distinctive ox-hide-shaped ingots that show up in shipwrecks and storerooms from one end of the sea to the other. Cyprus wasn't controlled by any single empire. It was a meeting ground, a neutral space where merchants from different civilizations could trade. Egyptian gold flowed through Cyprus, Hittite silver, Mycenaean manufactured goods, Levantine timber, Mesopotamian textiles. It all moved through Cypriot ports, creating wealth and connecting distant civilizations. This is what made the Late Bronze Age system remarkable. It wasn't just that these civilizations existed. Advanced civilizations had existed for over 2,000 years by this point. What was new was how interconnected they'd become. These weren't isolated cultures developing in parallel. They were actively trading, communicating, learning from each other. Royal letters show us kings addressing each other as brothers or father and son, depending on relative status. They sent each other gifts. They arranged marriages between royal families. Egyptian princesses married Hittite princes. Babylonian princesses went to Egypt. These weren't love marriages. They were diplomatic tools, cementing alliances and ensuring peace. But they also created real connections. When a Babylonian princess went to Egypt, she brought her household with her. Servants, scribes, craftsmen, her own little piece of Babylonia transplanted to the Egyptian court. Ideas, technologies, and cultural practices spread through these connections. Egyptian doctors used Mesopotamian medical texts. Hittite scribes copied Babylonian literature. Mycenaean craftsmen imitated Egyptian artistic styles. Trade networks moved more than goods. They moved knowledge. A tin trader travelling from Mesopotamia to the Aegean would pass through dozens of cities, each with its own innovations, its own discoveries. He'd carry stories, techniques, information. The Late Bronze Age world was experiencing a kind of slow-motion information revolution, where knowledge could spread across thousands of miles through personal contact and written correspondence. The wealth this generated was staggering. Egypt's temples were covered in gold. Hittite kings had access to iron. Mycenaean palaces stored vast quantities of bronze weapons and luxury goods. Ugarit's merchants owned fleets of ships and overseas properties. This wasn't just subsistence. This was wealth that could support art, literature, monumental architecture, standing armies, and bureaucracies. But underneath all this glittering prosperity was a fundamental fragility. The system worked because all the pieces worked. Cyprus supplied copper, trade routes stayed open, harvests came in, pirates stayed manageable, border wars remained limited, peace treaties held. The entire international system was like a house of cards, magnificent and impressive, but one strong wind could bring it all down. And unknown to the people living in this golden age, that wind was already beginning to blow. The world of 1250 BC seemed eternal to those living in it. How could Egypt fall? It had stood for 2,000 years. How could the Hittite Empire collapse? It commanded the most powerful military in the Near East. How could the trade networks that had enriched the Mediterranean for 3 centuries suddenly cease? They couldn't imagine the answer. But within 2 generations, every single one of these civilizations would be fighting for survival, and most of them would lose. Picture a merchant in Ugarit sometime around 1210 BC. He's standing on the docks watching ships come in from Cyprus, from Egypt, from the Aegean Islands. The harbour is still busy, goods are still moving, the palace scribes are still recording transactions on clay tablets just like they have for centuries. Everything looks normal, but if you know where to look, if you're paying attention to the small details, you can see the cracks forming. The ships aren't as numerous as they were 5 years ago. The grain shipments from Anatolia are smaller than expected, and there's something else. Something harder to define, a nervousness in the air. Merchants haggling more desperately over prices, palace officials asking more questions about inventory. A subtle tension, like everyone knows something bad is coming but nobody wants to say it out loud. This is how collapse begins. Not with a bang, not with armies appearing over the horizon, but with small disruptions, missing shipments, delayed caravans, prices slowly climbing, things that individually seem manageable, but collectively signal that something fundamental is breaking down. The first sign was the weather. Though people at the time wouldn't have understood it in modern terms, the climate was changing. We know this now because trees remember everything. Deep in the growth rings of ancient oaks and cedars, locked in the cellular structure of wood that's been dead for 3,200 years, lies a record of rainfall and temperature that's more accurate than any ancient text. Modern paleoclimatologists have extracted cores from these ancient trees, from fossilized pollen deposits in lake beds, from sediment layers at the bottom of the Mediterranean, and they all tell the same story. Starting around 1250 BC, maybe earlier, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of severe drought. Not a single bad year, not even a decade of poor harvests, but a sustained climate shift that lasted for generations. The tree rings show it clearly. Year after year of stunted growth, indicating reduced rainfall and longer dry seasons. Pollen records reveal forests retreating, grasslands turning to scrubland, agricultural zones shrinking as reliable water sources dried up. Lake levels dropped. Rivers that had fed civilizations for millennia began running low during the summer months. For agricultural societies dependent on regular rainfall and predictable flood cycles, this was catastrophic. The Egyptian texts call it years of famine. Hittite records speak of desperate grain shortages. Archaeological excavations show abandoned farms and villages across the eastern Mediterranean, places where people had lived continuously for centuries suddenly depopulated as the land became too dry to support them. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. These civilizations had survived droughts before. Every few generations the rains would fail for a year or two, harvests would be poor. People would tighten their belts and survive on stored grain until conditions improved. They had systems for this. Granaries with years of surplus. Trade networks that could import food from regions that were still productive. Social structures designed to redistribute resources during emergencies. This time was different. The drought didn't end after a year or two. It just kept going. Year after year, the rains failed to come in their usual abundance. Harvests were consistently below normal, and slowly, relentlessly, those carefully maintained grain reserves began to run out. Around 1200 BC, we start seeing something unprecedented in the archaeological record. Letters between kingdoms that aren't about trade agreements or diplomatic marriages or military alliances. They're about food, desperate requests for grain shipments, urgent pleas for help. There's a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashiya on Cyprus that's heartbreaking in its desperation. The Ugaritic king writes that his land is devastated by famine, that people are dying, that he needs grain immediately, not next month, not next season, now. The response from Cyprus is just as bleak. They're also suffering from famine and have nothing to spare. Similar letters have been found from the Hittite capital at Hattusa, the Hittite king writing to Egypt, to Ugarit, to anyone who might have surplus grain, begging for food shipments. And here's the crucial detail. These are kings writing these letters. Not administrators, not merchants, but the actual rulers of these empires admitting publicly that their kingdoms are starving. In stable times, this kind of admission would be unthinkable. It's admitting weakness, inviting invasion, undermining the divine authority that legitimized your rule. But by 1200 BC, the situation was so desperate that normal diplomatic protocols were breaking down. Survival trumped pride. The food crisis created a cascade of secondary problems. When harvests fail, farmers can't pay their taxes. When tax revenue drops, kingdoms can't pay their armies. When soldiers aren't getting paid, they start deserting. Or worse, they start raiding the very populations they're supposed to protect. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing militarization of civilian settlements. Villages that had never needed defensive walls suddenly building fortifications. towns constructing granaries inside protective compounds, as if they expected to be attacked by their own countrymen. We see evidence of peasant revolts spreading across the Hittite Empire, entire regions refusing to pay tribute, declaring independence from central authority. The Hittite kings responded with military force, but here's the problem. The same drought that was destroying the empire's agricultural base was also making it impossible to feed large armies in the field. Suppressing revolts became increasingly difficult when your soldiers were themselves on the edge of starvation. The economic strain was compounded by another crisis, one that's less obvious but equally devastating. The tin was disappearing. Now this might not sound like a big deal, but remember what these civilizations were called: the Bronze Age kingdoms. Bronze is what made their world possible. Bronze tools for farming, bronze weapons for armies, bronze fittings for ships. Without bronze, their entire technological infrastructure would collapse. But bronze isn't a natural material. It's an alloy, copper mixed with tin in specific proportions. And while copper was relatively abundant around the Mediterranean, tin was not. The major tin sources were far away, in Afghanistan, in Cornwall in Britain, possibly in Central Asia. Getting tin required maintaining trade routes that stretch for thousands of miles, crossing multiple kingdoms, travelling through territories controlled by dozens of different groups. These trade routes were the arteries of Bronze Age civilization. As long as they functioned, tin flowed to the copper-rich regions of Cyprus and Anatolia, bronze production continued, and the kingdoms remained strong. But trade routes are fragile things. They depend on political stability, on maintained roads and protected harbours, on trust between merchants and kingdoms, on the kind of predictable peace that allows valuable commodities to move safely across vast distances. Around 1200 BC, the archaeological evidence shows tin supplies becoming erratic. Bronze becomes more expensive. We start seeing evidence of bronze being recycled, old tools melted down to make new ones. Some regions begin producing lower quality bronze with less tin content. Others switch to iron, though the technology is still primitive and the weapons inferior. The exact reason for the tin shortage remains mysterious. Maybe the distant mines were disrupted by their own climate crises or political upheavals. Maybe the overland routes through Central Asia became unsafe. Maybe the maritime trade networks that connected the Mediterranean to the Atlantic were breaking down. Whatever the cause, the effect was clear. The fundamental material that gave these civilizations their name and their power was becoming scarce. This created a vicious cycle. Kingdoms desperate for tin became more aggressive, more willing to raid their neighbours' stockpiles. Competition for resources increased tensions. Increased tensions made trade more dangerous. More dangerous trade meant fewer merchants willing to make long journeys, which further restricted tin supply, which increased desperation, which increased conflict. The interconnectedness that had made Bronze Age civilization so prosperous was now accelerating its collapse. These kingdoms had spent centuries building a system where each region specialized in what it did best. Egypt grew grain. Cyprus mined copper. The Levantine cities like Ugarit and Byblos served as trade intermediaries. The Hittites controlled the routes to Central Asian tin. The Mycenaean Greeks provided maritime transport and manufactured luxury goods. In good times, this specialization created prosperity beyond anything possible in isolation. Each kingdom could focus on its comparative advantage, trading its surplus for necessities it couldn't produce efficiently itself. The whole system was greater than the sum of its parts, but specialization creates dependency. When Egypt's grain production failed due to drought, suddenly kingdoms that had stopped maintaining their own agricultural capacity were starving. When tin supplies were disrupted, kingdoms that had dismantled their own metallurgical traditions couldn't produce bronze. When trade routes became unsafe, Coastal cities that had abandoned subsistence farming in favour of commerce found themselves with nothing to trade and no way to feed their populations. The system had become so interconnected that a disruption anywhere could cascade into crisis everywhere. And by 1200 BC, disruptions were occurring everywhere simultaneously. Internal political instability was making everything worse. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the great powers for centuries, was fracturing. Succession disputes were becoming violent. Regional governors were asserting independence. The last few Hittite kings seemed to have spent most of their time trying to hold their own empire together, rather than dealing with external threats. Egyptian texts from this period show similar strains. The end of the 19th dynasty and beginning of the 20th was marked by political chaos. Multiple claimants to the throne, periods where it's unclear who actually controlled the government, references to corruption, to officials enriching themselves while the kingdom struggled, to a breakdown in the administrative systems that had made Egypt the most stable kingdom in the ancient world. When the central authority weakens, local strongmen rise, and local strongmen tend to look out for their own interests rather than the collective good. Archaeological evidence shows regions hoarding resources, refusing to share surpluses even when neighbouring areas were starving. The social contract that held these kingdoms together was breaking down. We can see it in the changing tone of diplomatic letters. Earlier correspondence between Bronze Age kingdoms is formal, respectful, following established protocols that had been refined over centuries. Kings call each other brother, emphasize their shared interests, resolve disputes through negotiation and careful diplomacy. By 1200 BC, the letters become more desperate, more accusatory. Kings blaming each other for the breakdown in trade, demands rather than requests, threats replacing diplomatic niceties. One Hittite king writes to a Syrian vassal in terms that sound more like a gangster demanding protection money than a legitimate monarch communicating with a subordinate. The facade of civilization was cracking, but nobody seemed to understand that they were watching their entire world approach a cliff edge. Each kingdom thought its problems were local, temporary, manageable. They kept trying to solve problems with the same tools that had worked for centuries. Send a military expedition to suppress revolts, import grain from neighbouring kingdoms, increase taxes to fund the army, strengthen border fortifications, all reasonable responses to crisis, all things that had worked before. But this time, these solutions weren't working, because the problems weren't temporary disruptions in an otherwise stable system. They were symptoms of the system itself breaking down. The merchants watching ships in Ugarit's harbour around 1210 BC couldn't have known they were living through the last normal years. Within a generation, that harbour would be empty, the palace would be burned, the city would be abandoned forever. Within a generation, half the Bronze Age kingdoms would simply cease to exist. But in 1210 BC, they just saw worrying signs: fewer ships, higher prices, unsettling rumours from distant kingdoms, problems that seemed serious but solvable. Nobody imagined that everything was about to fall apart. Nobody ever does. The tremors were getting stronger, the cracks were spreading, and then, somewhere over the northern horizon, something appeared that would transform these slow-building stresses into catastrophic collapse. The Sea Peoples were coming. But before we get to them, we need to understand one more thing about these early warning signs. They weren't happening in isolation. Every stress point, every weakness, every disruption was interacting with every other one, creating a web of cascading failures that would prove impossible to contain. The climate was changing, the food was running out, the trade networks were failing, the political systems were breaking down, and the social cohesion that held everything together was dissolving. These civilizations had survived crises before, survived wars and droughts and internal conflicts. But they'd never faced everything at once. And they'd never faced it at a time when their interdependence had made them so vulnerable to systemic collapse. The Bronze Age world was about to discover that sometimes, when everything goes wrong simultaneously, even the greatest civilizations in history can fall. They came from the sea. That's all anyone knew for certain. Ships by the hundreds, maybe thousands, appearing on the horizon like a storm system rolling in from the north. Warriors with unfamiliar weapons, speaking unknown languages, burning everything they touched. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples, but that wasn't really a name. It was an admission of ignorance. They had no idea who these people were, where they came from, or what they wanted. They just knew that everywhere the Sea Peoples went, civilizations died. The first detailed description comes from the mortuary temple of Rameses III at Medinet Habu, carved into stone around 1177 BC. The inscription reads like something from an apocalyptic nightmare. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. Hatti, Koda, Karkemish, Azawa, and Alashia were cut off at one time. Think about that for a moment. The Egyptian scribe is listing off kingdoms and city-states that had existed for centuries, some for over 1,000 years, and he's saying they were all destroyed simultaneously, cut off in a single wave of violence, not conquered and absorbed, not defeated and vassalized, but completely annihilated. The language suggests total destruction, the kind where cities burn to the ground and populations disappear from the historical record. But who were these destroyers? The Egyptian records actually give us names, lots of them. The Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh. Sometimes they mention the Sherden and Luka, though these groups seem to have appeared earlier, some even serving as mercenaries in Egyptian armies before turning hostile. Each name represents a different group within what the Egyptians called the Confederation of Sea Peoples. Not one unified nation, but multiple distinct cultures and ethnicities who somehow came together in a coordinated wave of destruction that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Modern historians have spent decades trying to match these Egyptian names to known cultures. The Peliset are probably the Philistines, who would later settle in coastal Palestine and become famous enemies of the biblical Israelites. The Shekelesh might be early Sicilians, the Sherden could be Sardinians, which would explain the distinctive horned helmets they wear in Egyptian depictions, remarkably similar to Bronze Age artifacts found in Sardinia. The Denyen might be related to the Greeks mentioned in Homer, possibly refugees from the collapsing Mycenaean civilization. But these identifications are all educated guesses based on linguistic similarities and archaeological correlations. The truth is, we're not certain about any of them. The Sea Peoples might as well have appeared from nowhere, and in some ways they did. The walls of Medinet Habu provide our best visual evidence of what these people looked like and how they fought. The reliefs are incredibly detailed, carved by Egyptian artists who had clearly seen the Sea Peoples up close, probably interviewed prisoners and examined captured equipment. The images show warriors who look distinctly different from Egyptians, different from Hittites, different from anyone the Egyptians had fought before. Some wear horned helmets or elaborate feathered headdresses. Others fight bareheaded, with long hair and beards in styles unknown in Egypt. Their weapons are equally distinctive. Long swords, different from the curved Kopesh blades favoured by Egyptians. Circular shields, smaller and more manoeuvrable than the large rectangular shields of Egyptian infantry. Spears designed for throwing, not just thrusting. But the most striking images show their ships. Dozens of vessels carved into the temple walls, showing what might be the first major naval battle in recorded history. The ships have high prows and sterns decorated with bird heads, probably swans or geese. No oars are visible, suggesting they relied primarily on sails. This is strange because most Mediterranean warships of the period used oars for better maneuverability in battle. Sailing ships are faster over long distances but harder to control in close combat. The fact that the Sea Peoples used them suggests they were designed for something else. Long-range voyages, migration. These weren't just warships. They were transport vessels capable of carrying entire families and all their possessions across hundreds of miles of open ocean. And that detail changes everything, because it suggests the Sea Peoples weren't just raiders. They were refugees, or maybe both simultaneously. Displaced populations fleeing some disaster in their homelands, desperate enough to attack one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. The reliefs at Medinet Habu actually show this. Among the warriors, you can see women and children in ox carts, household goods piled high, everything you'd expect from people who had abandoned their homes forever. These weren't professional soldiers launching a calculated campaign of conquest. These were entire populations on the move, fighting their way south because they had nowhere else to go. Rameses III's inscription gives us more details, though filtered through the propagandistic lens of Egyptian royal rhetoric. I prepared the river mouth like a strong wall with warships, galleys and barges. They were manned completely from bow to stern with valiant warriors bearing their arms, soldiers of all the choicest of Egypt, being like roaring lions upon the mountains. The chariotry consisted of runners, of picked men, of every good and capable chariot warrior. The pharaoh is describing a defensive position, not an offensive campaign. The Egyptians weren't sailing north to meet the Sea Peoples in their homeland. They were fortifying the Nile Delta, preparing to defend their own territory against an invasion that seemed unstoppable, and they had good reason to be terrified. By the time the Sea Peoples reached Egypt, they had already destroyed virtually every major civilization in their path. The archaeological evidence for this is overwhelming and chilling. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital in central Anatolia, archaeologists have found a destruction layer dated to around 1200 BC. The city was burned so thoroughly that the mud brick walls were literally baked to ceramic hardness. Similar destruction layers appear at dozens of sites across Anatolia, Greece and the Levant, at Troy, at Mycenae, at Pylos, at Tiryns, at Ugarit on the Syrian coast. City after city, all destroyed within a span of maybe 50 years, many of them showing signs of violent conflagration and sudden abandonment. The destruction at Ugarit is particularly revealing because we have written records from the final days. Clay tablets baked hard by the fires that destroyed the city preserve desperate messages from the king. In one letter, he writes to the king of Al-Ashia, probably Cyprus, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hatti land, and all my ships are in the Lucca land? Thus the country is abandoned to itself." The king is explaining that his military forces are deployed elsewhere, dealing with other crises. Ugarit is defenseless. And then the correspondence stops. The next layer in the archaeological record is ash, burnt timber, and collapsed walls. Nobody survived to file the tablets properly. They were still in the oven being baked when the city fell. This pattern repeats across the eastern Mediterranean. Coastal cities bearing the brunt of the attacks, inland centres collapsing shortly afterward as trade networks failed and refugees flooded in. The destruction wasn't random. It followed the trade routes, targeted the wealthier cities, and showed a sophisticated understanding of Mediterranean geography. Whoever the Sea Peoples were, they knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. But what were they looking for? Resources, new homes, revenge against civilizations that had exploited them? The answer might be all of the above, because the evidence suggests the sea peoples weren't a single phenomenon. They were multiple separate migrations and invasions, happening over decades, all lumped together by Egyptian scribes into one convenient category. Think of it like this. Something catastrophic happens in the Aegean and Anatolia starting around 1250 BC. Maybe it's the drought, maybe it's earthquakes, maybe it's internal political collapse. Whatever the cause, populations start moving. The first groups to leave might have been genuine raiders, warriors and their families fleeing collapsing kingdoms, trying to carve out new territories through force. They hit the wealthy coastal cities of the Levant, places like Ugarit and Byblos, and overwhelmed them through surprise and superior tactics. But their success triggered more migrations. As word spread that the old powers were weak, that cities could be taken and wealth seized, more groups joined the movement. Opportunists, pirates, mercenary bands, all of them heading south along the coast, following the trail of destruction. And behind them came the real refugees, farmers and craftsmen and merchants whose homes had been destroyed by the first wave, who had no choice but to follow the warrior south, hoping to find safety or at least survival in new lands. By the time this confederation reached Egypt, it was a massive heterogeneous force. Multiple ethnic groups with different languages and cultures, united only by desperation and the momentum of their movement. The Egyptian reliefs capture this diversity. Warriors with different helmets, different weapons, different styles of dress, all fighting side by side against the Egyptian defenders. Some of them might not have even wanted to attack Egypt. They might have just been caught up in a migration flow they couldn't escape, pushed south by populations behind them, unable to stop or turn back. But Ramesses III did something remarkable. He stopped them. The details are carved into those temple walls at Medinet Habu. The pharaoh deployed his forces in a defensive position at the mouths of the Nile, using Egypt's geography to his advantage. The sea peoples had to sail through narrow channels to reach the rich delta lands, channels that could be defended by archers on both banks, and the Egyptians were master archers. The reliefs show Egyptian bowmen, row upon row of them, raining arrows down on the sea people's ships, men falling into the water, ships capsizing, the distinctive bird-headed prows of the invaders' vessels sinking beneath the waves. It was a massacre. But the naval battle was just the beginning. The sea peoples also attacked by land, their ox carts and families following the coastal road into Egypt. Ramesses met them with chariots and infantry, the full professional might of the Egyptian military machine. And here's where Egypt's survival makes sense. Unlike the Hittites, unlike the Mycenaeans, Egypt had a centralized, well-supplied, professional standing army. They had fortified borders and a sophisticated logistics system. Most importantly, they had the Nile, a natural defensive barrier and an unmatched agricultural resource. Egypt could feed its armies. Egypt could maintain discipline and order. Egypt could absorb losses and keep fighting. The sea peoples couldn't. They were exhausted at the end of a long campaign of destruction that had taken them across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. They were fighting with whatever supplies they had brought with them, whatever they had looted along the way. When the Egyptian counterattack came, disciplined and overwhelming, the confederation broke. Some groups retreated, others were captured, enslaved, or killed. Some, like the Peliset, were allowed to settle in coastal regions of Canaan, becoming Egyptian vassals and providing a buffer against future invasions. They became the Philistines, settled in places like Gaza and Ashkelon, carrying on their culture but no longer a threat to Egyptian power. The inscriptions claimed total victory, Those who reached my border, their seed is not, their heart and their soul are finished forever and ever. Classic pharaonic propaganda. But in this case, it was mostly true. The Sea People's Confederation was destroyed as a military force. They would never threaten Egypt again. Rameses III had achieved what every other Bronze Age power had failed to do. He had stopped the invasion. But at what cost? The military campaign drained Egyptian resources at a time when the kingdom could least afford it. The population movements continued, destabilizing the entire region. Trade networks that Egypt depended on had been destroyed. The rich cities that bought Egyptian goods were gone, and while Egypt survived, it survived diminished, weakened, forced to turn inward just to maintain order. The Sea Peoples disappeared from history almost as mysteriously as they arrived. After their defeat in Egypt, they fragment into different populations, some settling, some disappearing entirely. The Philistines established their cities in Canaan. Other groups might have moved on to other regions, their identity dissolving as they were absorbed into local populations. We lose track of them in the archaeological record because they stop being a unified force. They become just more refugees in an age of migration and collapse, indistinguishable from all the other displaced peoples wandering through the ruins of the Bronze Age world. But their legacy remained. They had destroyed the old order as thoroughly as any apocalypse. The great kingdoms were gone, the trade networks were shattered, the cities were burned, and into that vacuum would eventually come new peoples, new kingdoms, new civilizations, the Phoenicians, the Israelites, the Aramaeans, eventually the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks. The world the Sea Peoples destroyed would never come back. What rose from its ashes would be something entirely different. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can understand what came after, we need to see exactly how each civilization fell, one by one like dominoes, until only Egypt remained standing in a world of ruins. Picture the Bronze Age world as a complex web of interconnected threads, trade routes like silk strands stretching across the Mediterranean, diplomatic marriages tying royal families together, merchant networks moving tin from Afghanistan to Greece, copper from Cyprus to Egypt, grain from Anatolia to the Levant. For centuries this web had held. When one thread weakened, others compensated. When one kingdom struggled, its allies sent aid. The system was resilient, adaptable, designed to absorb shocks. But resilience has limits, and what happened around 1200 BC wasn't a single shock. It was a cascading series of catastrophes that tore through the web like fire through dry grass. Once the first threads began snapping, the entire structure started to unravel. What took centuries to build came apart in decades. This wasn't just the fall of empires. This was the collapse of an entire world system. The Hittite Empire fell first, or maybe it fell last. The truth is, we're still not entirely sure because what happened to the Hittites is one of the most complete disappearances in ancient history. One moment, you have a superpower that had stood for nearly 500 years, an empire that had sacked Babylon, that had fought Egypt to a standstill, that controlled the richest trade routes in the Near East. Then within a generation, maybe less, it's just gone. Vanished so completely that for thousands of years, nobody even remembered it had existed. The capital city of Hattusa tells the story better than any written record could. This was one of the great cities of the ancient world. Massive stone fortifications stretching for miles, royal palaces with hundreds of rooms, temple complexes dedicated to the 1,000 gods of the Hittite pantheon, archive rooms filled with thousands of clay tablets documenting everything from international treaties to bread recipes. At its peak, maybe 40,000 to 50,000 people lived within those walls and in the surrounding settlements. When archaeologists excavated Hattusa in the early 20th century, they found a city that had been systematically destroyed, not just conquered, not just occupied by a new power, destroyed with a thoroughness that suggests either panic or rage, or both. The destruction layers show evidence of intense fires that burned hot enough to vitrify mud bricks, turning them into something like glass. Administrative buildings were gutted, the great temples burned, the royal archives were deliberately smashed, thousands of tablets shattered, as if someone wanted to erase every record, every memory of what the Hittites had been. But here's what makes the Hittite collapse so eerie. There are no bodies, no mass graves, no evidence of a siege, no arrowheads embedded in walls, no battering ram damage on the gates. The city was destroyed, yes, but it appears to have been almost completely empty when it burned. The population had already left. The question that has haunted historians for a century is simple and terrible. Where did they go? The last written records from Hattusa suggest the empire was still functioning right up until the end. There are administrative documents, supply lists, diplomatic correspondence, then nothing. The historical record just stops. It's like finding a ship's log where the entries are completely normal up until the last page, and then there are just blank pages forever after. Some of the final tablets hint at crisis, references to grain shortages, mentions of troops being moved to defend coastal territories. One fragmentary text speaks of ships burning and enemies coming from the sea. But these are hints, not explanations. Whatever happened, it happened fast enough that the bureaucracy didn't have time to process it. The great machine of empire was still churning out administrative documents even as the empire itself was dying. Within a generation, the entire Hittite heartland was depopulated, not conquered by another power, not absorbed into a new empire, just abandoned, empty. Archaeological surveys show that settlements across central Anatolia were left vacant. Some were never reoccupied. The sophisticated hierarchical society that had required cities, palaces, and professional administrators to function had simply ceased to exist. The survivors, whoever they were, had scattered into small villages or migrated elsewhere, reverting to simpler ways of life that left almost no archaeological trace. Meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, the Mycenaean world was dying its own death. But unlike the Hittites, whose collapse remains mysterious, the Mycenaean fall left clear evidence. It just doesn't tell a coherent story. The great palace centres of Bronze Age Greece, the places that later Greek poets would remember as the kingdoms of Agamemnon, Nestor and Odysseus, they fell one by one like dominoes. But they didn't all fall at the same time, and they didn't all fall the same way. Pylos in the southwest went first, destroyed around 1180 BC by fire so intense that clay tablets in the archives were baked hard, accidentally preserving administrative records that would otherwise have crumbled to dust. Those final tablets are haunting documents, supply lists for bronze workers, preparations for some kind of coastal defence, orders for rowers to be sent to places whose names we can no longer identify. Then the fire came, and the palace and everyone in it were consumed. Mycenae itself, the greatest of the palace centres, the fortress home of the High King in later legend, survived a bit longer. The massive fortification walls that later Greeks would call Cyclopean, built by giants because no human could move such enormous stones, those walls were hurriedly expanded around 1200 BC. Someone was expecting an attack. Someone was preparing for siege. Underground cisterns were constructed to ensure water supply if the city was cut off. The defences were strengthened at enormous cost in labour and resources. It didn't help. Around 1150 BC, perhaps later, the palace at Mycenae burned. The destruction was thorough. Like at Pylos, like at Hattusa, the great halls were gutted by fire. The administrative quarters destroyed. But unlike the Hittite capital, Mycenae didn't empty completely. The lower town remained occupied, but the people living there were different, poorer, simpler. The palace economy that had supported professional administrators, scribes, artists, and craftsmen was gone. Linear B writing, the syllabic script that Mycenaean bureaucrats had used to manage their kingdoms, disappeared from use. The knowledge of how to read and write was lost. For 400 years, Greece would be illiterate. This is what archaeologists call the Greek Dark Ages, but dark isn't really the right word. It wasn't that life stopped. People still farmed. They still raised families. They still told stories around fires at night, stories that would eventually become the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the complexity was gone. The sophisticated administrative systems, the long-distance trade networks, the monumental architecture, the specialized craftsmen who could make elaborate frescoes and delicate gold jewelry, all of it just stopped. Population estimates for Greece dropped by maybe 75% between the end of the Bronze Age and the depths of the Dark Ages. Some of that was death, surely, war, famine, disease. But much of it was migration and dispersal. Without the palace centres to organise and support large populations, people scattered into small villages and farmsteads, sustainable communities that could survive without external trade or centralised administration. Farther east, the collapse was playing out in real time, and we have the letters to prove it. The kingdom of Ugarit on the Syrian coast has given archaeologists something unique, a snapshot of the final moments. Ugarit was a wealthy port city, a trading hub where merchants from Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia and the Levant met to exchange goods and news. It was also a literate society that kept extensive records on clay tablets. When the city fell around 1185 BC, those tablets were buried and preserved. The final letters from Ugarit's king are desperate. One tablet, apparently never sent, is addressed to the king of Alashia, probably Cyprus. My father, behold, the enemy ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. Now the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. 7 ships. Just 7. Think about that. The king of a major Bronze Age power is writing about 7 enemy ships as if they represent a civilization-ending threat. Either he's massively exaggerating, or his kingdom was already so weakened, so depleted of defenders, that even a small raid was catastrophic. The letter suggests the latter. His army was away, helping the Hittites fight someone somewhere. His navy was deployed elsewhere. The kingdom was defenceless. Another tablet is even more chilling. It's addressed to an official on Cyprus. When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burnt and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it. These weren't written by professional scribes composing formal diplomatic correspondence. These were panic messages, scratched out hurriedly by someone who knew the end was coming. They were found in the ruins of Ugarit's palace, apparently prepared for sending but never actually dispatched. Before they could be sent, the enemy was at the gates. The palace burned. The city was destroyed so thoroughly that it was never rebuilt. 3,000 years later, archaeologists would find those unsent letters in the ruins, last words from a dying kingdom. But who burned Ugarit? The letters never say, just the enemy, just ships. The same terrible vagueness that haunts every account of the Bronze Age collapse. Cyprus was dying too. The island was one of the ancient world's most important copper sources. Bronze, remember, requires both copper and tin, and Cyprus had copper in abundance. Whoever controlled Cyprus controlled much of the Bronze Age economy. Excavations across the island reveal a pattern of destruction in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC. Kition burned, Enkomi burned. Cinder was destroyed and abandoned. Palapaphos shows massive destruction layers. These weren't all destroyed at the same moment, but within a generation or two nearly every major settlement on Cyprus had been violently ended. Some sites show evidence of reconstruction, but what rose from the ashes was different, poorer. The grand buildings of the late Bronze Age were replaced by simpler structures. Foreign pottery begins appearing in the archaeological record, Mycenaean Greek styles, suggesting refugees or migrants from the Greek mainland. The old Cypriot kingdoms, whatever they had been, were gone. The island fragmented into smaller, less centralized communities. The Kassite dynasty of Babylon, which had ruled for over 400 years, fell to Elamite invaders around 1155 BC. This was after decades of increasing pressure from outside forces and internal instability. The great power that had once rivaled Egypt was reduced to a shadow. Babylonia would survive, but it would take centuries to recover its former glory. Along the Levantine coast, city after city fell. Hazor in Canaan, one of the largest Bronze Age cities, was destroyed in a massive conflagration. Lachish burned, Megiddo burned, Ashkelon burned. Ashdod was destroyed and then reoccupied by people with different pottery styles, different building techniques. The archaeological record suggests newcomers, but who they were and where they came from remains hotly debated. Some cities survived, but they were changed. Tyre and Sidon, the great Phoenician ports, seemed to have weathered the storm better than most. They were damaged, certainly. Their populations probably declined, but they weren't abandoned. Within a few generations, they would begin to thrive again, taking advantage of the power vacuum to build new trading networks. The Phoenician civilization that would eventually found Carthage and sail beyond the Pillars of Hercules was born from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse. But that was later. For now, the world was breaking. The web of interconnections that had supported Bronze Age civilization was tearing apart. When the Hittite Empire fell, it stopped providing the grain and metals that other kingdoms depended on. When Mycenaean Greece collapsed, it stopped importing Egyptian grain and Cypriot copper, which meant those producers lost markets and revenue. When Cyprus was destroyed, the copper supply dried up, which meant bronze production everywhere suffered, which meant weapons and tools became scarce, which meant kingdoms couldn't defend themselves or maintain their economies. It was a death spiral. Each collapse made the next more likely. Each fallen kingdom removed another pillar holding up the whole structure. The Bronze Age world wasn't a collection of independent civilizations that happened to exist at the same time. It was an integrated system, dependent on trade, diplomacy, and mutual support to function. When the system started failing, it failed everywhere at once. And in the center of this collapsing world, one kingdom stood alone, battered but unbroken, watching its allies and rivals fall while it desperately fought to survive. That kingdom was Egypt. While civilization after civilization collapsed into darkness, one empire stood firm against the chaos: Egypt, the last great power of the Bronze Age. But here's what makes Egypt's survival so remarkable. It wasn't that they avoided the catastrophe. They didn't. They got hit by everything that destroyed their neighbors. The same droughts, the same famines, the same mysterious invaders washing up on their shores like a human tsunami. The difference was that Egypt had something the others didn't: geography, resources, and one pharaoh who refused to let his kingdom become another corpse in history's greatest graveyard. Ramesses III. He came to power around 1186 BC, right in the middle of the collapse. Imagine inheriting an empire when literally every other civilization around you is actively disintegrating. The Hittites, gone. The Mycenaeans, gone. The coastal cities of Syria and Canaan, burning. Trade networks that had existed for centuries shattered. And now massive armies of desperate refugees and warriors are heading straight for your borders, looking for somewhere, anywhere that still has food and water and stability. Most rulers would have panicked. Most kingdoms would have fallen within years. But Egypt had advantages built into its very geography. The Nile. That single river was Egypt's lifeline, and unlike the rain-dependent agriculture that failed across the Mediterranean, the Nile's annual flooding was driven by monsoons far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands. When droughts hammered Greece and Anatolia, the Nile mostly kept flowing. Not always at full strength. Records from this period mention years of emptiness when the inundation failed, but enough to keep Egyptian agriculture functioning when everyone else was starving. Then there was the desert. Egypt was protected by vast barriers of sand on both sides. You couldn't just march an army across that emptiness. Invaders had to come through predictable routes, the Nile Delta in the north, narrow desert roads in the east. This meant Egypt could concentrate its defences in ways other kingdoms couldn't. The Hittites had to defend a massive frontier with dozens of vulnerable points. Egypt could funnel attackers into kill zones. But geography alone doesn't win wars. Rameses III did something that separated him from the rulers who failed. He adapted. The traditional Egyptian military had been built for chariot warfare, rapid strikes, across open terrain. That wasn't going to work against the Sea Peoples. These weren't organized armies with supply lines you could cut or capitals you could capture. These were migration waves, entire populations on the move, fighting with the desperation of people who had nowhere left to go. So Rameses changed tactics. He fortified the delta, turning the marshy northern coastline into a defensive network of forts and strongpoints. He positioned archers and infantry in overlapping fields of fire. He built or requisitioned a fleet of warships, not for trade or showing the flag, but for actual combat. Egypt hadn't fought a major naval battle in generations. Now, they had to learn fast or die. The first wave came around 1180 BC. The Sea Peoples, we still don't know exactly who they all were, hit Egypt's western borders through Libya. They had allied with Libyan tribes, swelling their numbers even more. The Egyptian records from Rameses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu describe them in apocalyptic terms. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. But Egypt stood. Rameses met them with a combined force of chariots, infantry and mercenaries. The battle was brutal. Thousands died on both sides. But the Egyptians held, pushing the invaders back into the desert, where logistics and thirst finished what arrows had started. It was a victory, but a costly one. And Rameses knew more waves were coming. He was right. The big one came around 1177 BC. Multiple groups of Sea Peoples, having destroyed every other Bronze Age power, converged on Egypt by land and sea. The land army moved down through Canaan, leaving destruction in their wake. The maritime force, hundreds of ships packed with warriors and their families, sailed toward the Nile Delta. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion. A desperate attempt by people who had burned through every other option to take the last functioning civilization left standing. Rameses III prepared for the fight of his life. He positioned his land forces to meet the overland invasion in southern Canaan, blocking the coastal roads before the Sea Peoples could reach Egyptian territory proper. Meanwhile, he gathered his fleet in the Nile Delta's waterways and prepared for a naval battle unlike anything Egypt had ever fought. The battle itself has gone down as one of the most decisive naval engagements in ancient history. The Egyptian accounts, carved in stone and painted on temple walls, show it in vivid detail. Rameses positioned his ships in the narrow channels where the Nile emptied into the Mediterranean. The Sea People's vessels, loaded with warriors and supplies, sailed straight into the trap. Egyptian archers on the ships and lining the shores unleashed volley after volley. The Sea People's ships designed for Mediterranean sailing couldn't maneuver in the tight waters. They became floating targets. The artwork shows Egyptian soldiers raining arrows down on enemy vessels. Sea People's warriors falling into the water, weighed down by their armor and weapons. Ships capsizing, men drowning in the delta's muddy waters. The Egyptians even used grappling hooks to capsize enemy vessels, dumping their occupants into the river where they could be picked off or captured. It was slaughter, systematic and brutal. The kind of victory that doesn't just defeat an enemy, but breaks their will to fight. On land, Egyptian forces crushed the overland invasion in a series of engagements. The Sea Peoples, already weakened by years of migration and warfare, couldn't break through Egyptian defensive positions. They were exhausted, far from any supply base, fighting an enemy on home territory. The campaign ended with Egyptian victory, but it wasn't total annihilation. That's where things get really interesting. Rameses III did something unexpected with the defeated Sea Peoples. He didn't just slaughter them or drive them back into the wasteland. He couldn't. There were too many of them, and Egypt needed soldiers. The long wars had depleted Egyptian manpower. So he made them an offer. Settle in the territories Egypt controlled in Canaan and southern Syria. Serve as garrison troops and mercenaries. Basically, become Egypt's border guards. It was brilliant realpolitik. The Sea Peoples got land and stability, something they'd been fighting for. Egypt got a buffer zone of battle-hardened warriors between themselves and any future threats. The settlements were positioned strategically along the coast and in key inland areas. The Sea Peoples would defend these territories because they were now their homes, and any invader coming south would have to go through them first. This is how the Philistines entered history. Yes, those Philistines, the ones who show up in the biblical texts as the antagonists of the Israelites. They were Sea Peoples, probably from the Aegean or Anatolia originally, who settled in the coastal region that would become known as Philistia. They brought their own culture, their own pottery styles, even their own burial customs. Archaeological evidence shows they maintained a distinct identity for generations, different from the Canaanites around them. But here's what's crucial. The Philistines and other settled Sea Peoples became part of Egypt's strategic defense system. They were the tripwire, the early warning system, the expendable troops who would take the first hit from any future invasion. Egypt had turned its greatest threat into its first line of defense. For a while, this worked. Egypt survived when no one else did. The new kingdom continued, diminished but functional. Trade started flowing again, at least along routes Egypt could control. Temples were built or repaired. The machinery of Egyptian bureaucracy ground on, recording floods and harvests and tax receipts. All the boring paperwork that indicates a civilization is still alive. But survival came at a terrible cost. The wars had drained the treasury. The loss of trade networks meant Egypt was isolated, cut off from resources it had relied on for centuries. Tin for bronze became scarce. Luxury goods from abroad disappeared. The empire had to turn inward, relying on its own resources in a way it hadn't for generations. More importantly, the social fabric was fraying. The military campaigns had elevated the army to new prominence. Generals became power brokers. The priesthood, always influential in Egypt, grew even more powerful as people turned to the gods for protection against the chaos beyond the borders. The pharaoh's authority, once absolute, was now shared with institutions that had their own agendas. Rameses III held it together through force of personality and military success. But even he couldn't escape the consequences of Egypt's survival. In year 32 of his reign, around 1155 BC, members of his own court conspired to kill him. The harem conspiracy, as it's known, involved multiple wives, palace officials, and even some military officers. They wanted to put a different heir on the throne, probably someone they thought they could control. The assassination attempt succeeded, sort of. Sources are unclear, but the most recent analysis of Ramesses III's mummy suggests his throat was cut. He probably died from the wound, though the conspiracy itself failed. The designated conspirators were caught and executed. The crown prince, Ramesses IV, took power and secured his position. But the damage was done. The pharaoh who had saved Egypt from the Sea Peoples, who had stood against the tide that destroyed every other Bronze Age empire, died at the hands of his own courtiers. It was a sign of how unstable things had become. When your own palace isn't safe, when the people closest to the throne are plotting murder, the empire is already in decline no matter how many foreign enemies you've defeated. Ramesses IV tried to maintain his father's legacy, but he was fighting a losing battle. Each subsequent pharaoh had less power, less wealth, less authority. The high priests of Amun in Thebes became virtually independent rulers of southern Egypt. The empire began fragmenting into competing power centers, not all at once, not with the dramatic suddenness that destroyed the Hittites or Mycenaeans, but slowly, inevitably, like a stone wearing away under constant water. The irony is brutal. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse only to spend the next several centuries declining anyway. They avoided the sudden death that took their neighbours, but couldn't escape the long deteriorating aftermath. The New Kingdom, that period of imperial glory and international dominance, ended around 1077 BC, with Egypt divided between competing dynasties. The next several centuries saw Egypt invaded repeatedly by Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, eventually Persians and Greeks. The civilization that stood alone, that refused to fall, when everything else did, discovered that survival and recovery are two different things. They had saved themselves from immediate destruction, but couldn't rebuild the interconnected world that had made Bronze Age Egypt wealthy and powerful. That world was gone, shattered beyond repair. Egypt continued, but as a shadow of what it had been. By the time the Iron Age civilizations emerged centuries later, Egypt was no longer the dominant superpower. That role had passed to others, to the Assyrians, then the Persians, eventually the Greeks and Romans. The survivors had survived, but they had not won. They had simply lasted long enough to watch a new world emerge, one where the old certainties of Bronze Age civilization were forgotten myths. But in those desperate years around 1177 BC, none of that future decline was certain. In that moment, Ramesses III and his Egypt stood as proof that collapse wasn't inevitable, that human organization and adaptation could overcome even the worst catastrophes. That sometimes, when everything is falling apart, strong leadership and geographic luck can make the difference between extinction and survival. Egypt's desperate defense became the hinge point of ancient history. If they had fallen too, if the Sea Peoples had broken through and destroyed the last functioning Bronze Age state, the Dark Age that followed might have lasted centuries longer. Instead, Egypt's survival preserved knowledge, technologies, and cultural memories that would eventually help spark the recovery. They were the bridge between the Bronze Age world that died and the Iron Age world that would rise from its ashes. But that bridge was built on corpses, thousands who died in the Delta, tens of thousands who perished in the famines and wars, and ultimately the slow death of Egyptian imperial power itself, sacrificed to buy survival in a world that had gone mad. Now, here's where the story moves from ancient texts and epic tales into something you can actually touch. Because scattered across the Mediterranean and Near East, Buried under centuries of accumulated dirt and debris lies physical evidence of what happened in 1177 BC. And when you start digging into these sites, when you actually look at what the archaeologists have found, the picture that emerges is both clearer and more terrifying than any ancient chronicle could convey. Let me take you to Hattusa first. The Hittite capital, once home to perhaps 40,000 people, a city of monumental architecture, massive fortification walls, elaborate temples, the beating heart of an empire that had lasted for over 400 years. When archaeologists excavated it, they found something that stops you cold, a destruction layer. Not just scattered evidence of damage, but a distinct stratum of ash, burned material, and collapsed architecture that covers the entire site. This wasn't gradual decline. This wasn't slow abandonment. This was catastrophic destruction, sudden and complete. But here's what makes it even more chilling. Above that destruction layer, there's almost nothing. No evidence of rebuilding. No signs that anyone tried to restore the city or salvage what remained. Just a thin accumulation of wind-blown soil. Then nothing for centuries. The Hittites didn't lose their capital and rebuild somewhere else. They simply ceased to exist as a political entity. 40,000 people gone. An entire civilization's administrative center abandoned forever. And Hattusa isn't unique. Across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have found the same pattern at site after site. Ugarit on the Syrian coast shows a massive destruction layer dated precisely to around 1190 BC. The palace was burned so intensely that stone blocks cracked from the heat. In some rooms they found cuneiform tablets that had been baked hard by the flames, preserving them accidentally for modern scholars to read. These tablets contain the city's final correspondence, pleas for help that never came, frantic messages about enemy ships appearing on the horizon. In one room at Ugarit, archaeologists found something that gives you chills when you think about it. A pile of bronze weapons, spearheads and arrowheads stacked near the palace entrance. They weren't stored in the armory. They were gathered hastily as if someone was preparing for a last stand. Next to them, scattered pottery that had been smashed when the building collapsed. These weren't carefully packed away. These were grabbed in panic, then dropped when whoever held them either fled or died. Move south to Megiddo in what's now Israel. Another major city, another destruction layer from the late Bronze Age. But Megiddo shows us something different. It wasn't just destroyed once. The archaeological record shows it was burned, partially rebuilt, then destroyed again and again. Like the inhabitants kept trying to restore it, kept refusing to give up, until finally there were no more inhabitants to try. The city that would later become famous in biblical literature as Armageddon, the site of the final battle, was already living through its own apocalypse 3,000 years ago. Then there's Mycenae itself, the legendary home of Agamemnon, the most powerful city in Bronze Age Greece. The citadel shows clear evidence of destruction around 1200 BC. The massive fortification walls, some of the most impressive defensive architecture in the ancient world, walls so huge that later Greeks thought they must have been built by giants, didn't save it. Whatever hit Mycenae got through those walls or bypassed them entirely. The palace complex shows evidence of intense fire. Storerooms filled with pottery were burned so hot that the clay vessels fused together. Linear B tablets found in the ruins contain bureaucratic records that just stop, mid-inventory, mid-sentence, as if the scribe simply put down his stylus and ran. Now, here's where it gets archaeologically fascinating. At dozens of these sites, researchers have found hoarded treasures, not in palaces or temples where you'd expect official treasuries, but hidden in private homes, buried under floors, stuffed into walls, concealed in cisterns. These are personal collections, jewellery, silver, bronze tools, hastily buried by people who thought they'd come back for them later. They never did. In Cyprus, at the site of Enkomi, archaeologists found a copper workshop with the furnaces still loaded, ready to be fired. The bronze smith had laid out his moulds, prepared his materials, then abandoned everything. Outside the workshop they found a partially completed bronze statue still in its mould. Whoever was making it never finished, never came back to complete what would have been weeks of careful work. That level of abandonment speaks to panic, to disaster so overwhelming that skilled craftsmen left behind valuable materials and unfinished commissions that would have been worth considerable money. At Troy, the legendary city that may or may not have been destroyed by Greeks in the Trojan War, there's a destruction layer from roughly this period. Troy Sevdame, as archaeologists label it, shows evidence of fire and violent destruction. In the ruins they found human skeletons that were never properly buried, bodies left where they fell. One skeleton was found in a street, crushed under collapsed masonry. Another in a doorway, as if the person was trying to escape when the building came down. These aren't battle casualties that were left temporarily and then retrieved. These are people whose bodies were never recovered, never given proper burial, because there was nobody left to do it. But perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from unfinished meals. At several sites, archaeologists have found cooking pots still on hearths, storage jars with their contents intact, grinding stones with grain still on them. At Tichos Daimaion in Greece, they found a house with a meal laid out on a table. The family had set their places, started eating, then fled. The food was still there when archaeologists excavated it 3,200 years later, carbonized by the fire that consumed the house shortly after they left. Think about what it takes to abandon a meal mid-bite. What kind of threat appears so suddenly, so overwhelmingly that you drop your food and run? Not slowly advancing armies that you can see coming for days, not sieges that develop gradually. This is immediate catastrophe. Now, let's talk about the Amarna letters. These aren't from the destruction itself, but from the decades leading up to it, and they're probably the most extraordinary archaeological find for understanding this period. Found at Akhetaten in Egypt, Akhenaten's short-lived capital, these are diplomatic letters written on clay tablets in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age. Their correspondence between Egyptian pharaohs and rulers across the Near East, and they paint an incredibly detailed picture of how the Bronze Age international system worked. What makes them so valuable is that they're not propaganda. These are working documents, actual letters between rulers discussing trade agreements, marriage alliances, military cooperation, and complaints. The king of Cyprus complains about pirates attacking his ships. The king of Babylon wants more gold from Egypt. Smaller kingdoms beg for military assistance against bandits and raiders. You can read the increasing desperation in the later letters. Pleas for help that become more urgent. Reports of cities under attack. Requests for troops that apparently were never sent. One letter from the king of Alashia, probably Cyprus, is particularly chilling. He tells the pharaoh that his lands have been destroyed, his cities burned, and asks, almost desperately, whether Egypt has suffered similar attacks. You can feel his confusion, his need to understand if this catastrophe is local or part of something larger. The pharaoh apparently never answered, or if he did, that letter doesn't survive. The correspondence just stops, like so much else from this period. Then there are the shipwrecks. The most famous is the Uluburun wreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey in 1982. This ship sank around 1300 BC, about a century before the collapse, and it's like a time capsule of Bronze Age trade. The cargo is staggering in its diversity. 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin, possibly from Afghanistan, glass ingots from Syria or Egypt, ebony from Africa, ivory from elephants and hippos, gold and silver jewellery, Baltic amber, terebinth resin, blackwood from the Sudan, ostrich eggs, turtle shells, hippopotamus teeth, weapons, tools, and luxury goods from a dozen different regions. This single ship was carrying resources from across the entire Bronze Age world. It was a floating warehouse of international trade, and there must have been dozens, maybe hundreds of ships like it sailing the Mediterranean at any given time. When the Bronze Age system collapsed, all of this stopped. The trade networks that had taken centuries to build disintegrated in a few decades. And we know they disintegrated because after 1200 BC, shipwrecks with this kind of diverse cargo disappear from the archaeological record. Trade didn't just decrease, it essentially ceased to exist in its Bronze Age form. The skeletal evidence tells its own grim story. At multiple sites, bioarchaeologists have found evidence of malnutrition in populations from this period. Not chronic malnutrition from poverty, but acute nutritional stress. People who had been eating adequately suddenly weren't getting enough food. Bones show arrested growth lines, evidence that children's development was interrupted by periods of starvation. Teeth show enamel defects formed during times of severe nutritional stress. At some sites, there's clear evidence of violence. Not organised warfare with soldiers dying in battle, but massacre. At Lachish, skeletons. Show perimortem trauma, injuries at or near the time of death. Skulls crushed by blunt weapons. Cut marks on bones from swords or axes. These aren't warrior burials with grave goods and honour. These are mass graves, bodies dumped hastily, without ceremony. Population displacement is visible too. Genetic studies of skeletal remains show that populations in many regions changed composition during this period. People with different genetic ancestry suddenly appear in areas where they hadn't been before. This suggests large-scale population movements, refugees fleeing destroyed cities and settling wherever they could find safety. But here's what's really remarkable. Modern technology is revealing things that earlier archaeologists never could have discovered. Ground-penetrating radar has shown that many Bronze Age cities were far larger than the excavated portion suggested. Beneath the ground, invisible to traditional excavation, lie entire neighbourhoods that were abandoned and never rebuilt. Satellite imagery is revealing ancient road networks, showing how cities were connected by trade routes that fell out of use after the collapse. In some regions, you can see from aerial photographs where fields were abandoned, where irrigation systems broke down and were never repaired. DNA analysis of ancient grains is showing that the crops people were growing changed after the collapse. The diverse agriculture of the Bronze Age gave way to simpler farming focused on hardier, lower-yield crops. People were growing food to survive, not to trade. Isotope analysis of human teeth is revealing migration patterns with unprecedented precision. By analysing oxygen and strontium isotopes in tooth enamel, researchers can tell where people spent their childhoods, and they're finding that populations became far more mobile during the collapse period. People who grew up in one region died in another, evidence of widespread displacement. Climate data from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment cores is giving us year-by-year resolution on weather patterns during this period. And what it shows is striking. The decades around 1200 BC were marked by severe drought in the eastern Mediterranean, crop failures, and climate volatility. But here's what all this evidence points to when you put it together. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just political or military, it was systemic. Every level of society was affected, from kings in their palaces to farmers in their fields. The destruction wasn't limited to one region or one type of site. It was everywhere, hitting coastal cities and inland settlements, large capitals and small towns. Most tellingly, the abandonment was often permanent. These weren't cities that were destroyed and then rebuilt by conquerors. They were destroyed and left as ruins. for centuries in some cases, until completely different populations with completely different cultures eventually resettled them. The physical evidence tells us that whatever happened in the decades around 1177 BC was catastrophic enough to shatter not just political structures, but the entire social and economic system that had sustained Bronze Age civilization. Trade networks that had existed for centuries collapsed. Technologies were lost. Literacy disappeared in many regions. Population levels dropped dramatically and took centuries to recover. And all of this happened not over centuries, but over decades. Maybe even faster at individual sites. A generation that grew up in palace cities with international trade, professional armies, and bureaucratic administration raised children in a world where those things had become memories, stories of a golden age that seemed increasingly impossible to believe. The ruins tell us that the Bronze Age didn't decline. It didn't gradually transform into something else. It collapsed, suddenly and catastrophically, leaving behind burned palaces, abandoned cities, and scattered survivors trying to make sense of a world that had been utterly transformed. But what actually caused all this destruction? That's where the archaeological evidence starts to become ambiguous, where we move from what we can prove to what we can only theorize. Because the ruins show us the collapse happened, but they don't conclusively tell us why. So what actually happened? After a century of archaeology, thousands of excavations, millions of pottery shards catalogued and analysed, countless scholarly debates, here's the honest answer: nobody knows for sure. And that's not because archaeologists aren't doing their jobs. It's because the Bronze Age collapse might be the most complex historical catastrophe ever recorded. Multiple theories exist, each one supported by solid evidence, each one explaining part of the picture, but none of them explaining everything. Let's walk through them one by one. The invasion theory was first. It's the oldest explanation and in many ways the most dramatic. According to this view, the Sea Peoples were the primary cause of everything that went wrong. They weren't just raiders or refugees. They were a massive invasion force. Hundreds of thousands of warriors from somewhere in the Mediterranean or beyond, descending on the civilized world like a plague of locusts. The evidence for this seems compelling at first glance. Nearly every collapsed site shows signs of violent destruction. Fire layers in the archaeological record, scattered weapons, bodies left unburied in the streets, Egyptian inscriptions describing massive battles against foreign invaders. Ramesses III's temple reliefs showing ships full of warriors, ox carts loaded with women and children, the classic signature of a migrating population looking for new lands to conquer. For decades, this was the standard explanation. Civilization fell because barbarians invaded. Simple, dramatic, easy to understand. It fit perfectly with how people thought about history in the early 20th century. Civilizations rise. Civilizations get soft and decadent. Barbarians come in and destroy everything. The cycle of history. But dig deeper, and the invasion theory starts developing problems. Big problems. First, who exactly were these Sea Peoples? The Egyptian texts name various groups: the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, but they never tell us where these people actually came from. Archaeological evidence doesn't help much either. We've never found a Sea People's homeland. No region in the Mediterranean shows the kind of population collapse you'd expect if hundreds of thousands of warriors had suddenly departed. No distinctive pottery style that we can track spreading across the region. No weapons or ship designs unique to the invaders that we can trace back to a point of origin. Second, the timeline doesn't quite work. The destructions weren't simultaneous. They happened over decades, maybe even a century. If this was a single coordinated invasion, you'd expect a much tighter sequence of events. A massive force moving systematically from target to target. Instead, We see sporadic destructions, some cities falling while their neighbours survive, some regions devastated while others nearby show no damage at all. This looks less like a military campaign and more like a cascading collapse, with opportunistic raiding happening amid the chaos. Third, and this is crucial, the invasion theory doesn't explain why the civilizations were so vulnerable in the first place. The Hittite Empire at its peak commanded armies of tens of thousands. They had professional soldiers, sophisticated siege equipment, intelligence networks, fortified cities. How does a bunch of seaborne raiders destroy an empire like that? It's like saying a group of pirates destroyed the United States. Even if they won a few battles, the structural power of the empire should have been able to recover and respond, unless something else had already weakened the empire so badly that it couldn't mount an effective defence, unless the sea peoples weren't the disease, but just one of the symptoms. That's where the environmental catastrophe hypothesis comes in. Starting in the 1990s, climate scientists and archaeologists began working together, analysing everything from ancient tree rings to lake sediment cores to ice samples from Greenland. And they found something remarkable. Right around 1200 BC, the climate went completely haywire. The eastern Mediterranean entered one of the most severe drought periods in the last 4,000 years. We're not talking about a bad year or two. We're talking about decades of crop failures, probably 50 to 150 years of significantly reduced rainfall across the entire region. Tree ring data from ancient junipers in Turkey shows growth rings so narrow they're almost invisible. Evidence of extreme water stress year after year. Lake levels across the Mediterranean dropped dramatically. Pollen records show forests dying back and being replaced by scrub vegetation. The evidence is overwhelming. Something went catastrophically wrong with the climate right when the Bronze Age collapse happened. Now imagine you're managing a Bronze Age civilization when the rains start failing. Your agriculture is sophisticated but fragile. You've built irrigation systems that work beautifully when water is available, but you don't have deep wells or modern drought-resistant crop varieties. Your population has grown to match the carrying capacity of your territory during good years. You don't have massive surplus storage. Maybe a year or two of emergency grain, but not a decade. The first year of bad harvests, you manage. You draw down your reserves, maybe import some grain from neighbours who had better luck. The second year it's tighter. Rations get reduced. Prices start rising. The palatial economy starts straining. The third year, you're in crisis. Food riots in the cities. Regional governors hoarding whatever grain they have. Trade networks breaking down because nobody wants to export food when their own people are starving. By year 5 or 6, you're not a civilization anymore. You're a collection of desperate communities, each trying to survive in isolation. The drought theory explains so much. It explains why multiple civilizations fell around the same time. They were all dependent on the same climate system. It explains why recovery took so long, because the drought itself lasted for decades. It explains why trade collapsed, because drought-stricken regions couldn't produce the surplus goods that made trade profitable. It even explains the sea peoples, environmental refugees from regions hit hardest by the drought, becoming raiders and migrants because staying home meant starvation. But the drought theory has problems too. Some regions that should have been devastated by drought show minimal disruption. Egypt survived, and it was just as dependent on rainfall and Nile floods as anywhere else. Some Mesopotamian cities kept functioning throughout the period, and drought doesn't explain the specific pattern of destruction we see. Why were palatial centres systematically burned while rural villages often survived? Why did literacy disappear? You don't forget how to write just because it stopped raining. That's where the systems collapse theory comes in. This is more abstract, more theoretical, but it might be the most important explanation. Anthropologists and complexity scientists have studied how complex societies fail, how empires that seem invincible can suddenly disintegrate. And they've found something fascinating. Complex societies don't fail gradually. They collapse suddenly, all at once, like a house of cards where you pull out one card and the whole structure comes down. Bronze Age civilizations were incredibly complex systems. They had elaborate bureaucracies managing everything from agriculture to metallurgy. They had specialized labor, people who only made pottery or only worked bronze or only served as scribes. They had long-distance trade networks bringing in essential resources from hundreds of miles away. They had military systems that required constant investment in training, equipment, and fortifications. All of these elements were interdependent. The palatial economy needed taxes from farmers to pay craftsmen. Craftsmen needed tin and copper from distant sources to make bronze. Bronze weapons kept the military strong. The military kept the trade routes open and collected the taxes. Remove any one element and the whole system starts to wobble. Now add some stress. Maybe a drought that reduces agricultural surplus. Maybe increased pirate activity that disrupts trade routes. Maybe a powerful enemy that requires expensive military campaigns. Initially, the system adapts. Administrators work harder. Taxes get raised. Resources get redirected. The palace squeezes every bit of efficiency out of the existing structure. But there's a limit. Push any complex system too hard and it doesn't just slow down, it breaks. Catastrophically. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter studied this phenomenon extensively. He found that societies reach a point where increased complexity stops providing benefits and starts becoming a burden. The administration gets so elaborate that it consumes more resources than it produces. The taxes needed to maintain the system become so heavy that people start abandoning it. The whole structure becomes simultaneously fragile and inflexible. When that tipping point is reached, collapse can happen incredibly fast, within a generation, sometimes within years. The palace can't collect enough taxes to pay its administrators. Administrators can't maintain the infrastructure. Infrastructure fails and trade collapses. Without trade, specialized craftsmen can't get raw materials. Without craftsmen, the military can't maintain its equipment. Without an effective military, regional governors break away. Without centralized control, literacy becomes useless. Who needs to write if there's no palace to send records to? The whole edifice of civilization simply stops functioning. People don't forget how to read and write through some mysterious amnesia. They stop using literacy because it no longer serves any practical purpose in a collapsed society. This explains the sudden quality of the Bronze Age collapse, why so many civilizations failed within decades of each other, not because they were all invaded simultaneously or all hit by drought simultaneously, but because they were all structured similarly, all at the same level of complexity, all approaching the same breaking point. When one major system collapsed, it created cascading failures throughout the interconnected Mediterranean world. But wait, there's more. Some researchers think geology played a major role. The earthquake storm hypothesis suggests that the eastern Mediterranean experienced an unprecedented cluster of major earthquakes right around 1200 BC. The evidence is compelling. Archaeological sites across the region show destruction layers consistent with seismic activity. Walls that collapsed outward rather than being pushed inward by attackers. Buildings pancaked by falling roofs. No signs of fire or looting, just sudden structural failure. Ancient texts from the period mention earthquakes. The Hittite archives contain references to cities destroyed by earth shaking. Egyptian records describe similar events. Geologists studying the regional tectonic system have found that the eastern Mediterranean sits at the intersection of several major fault lines. The African plate pushing north into the Eurasian plate, the Anatolian plates sliding westward. These tectonic boundaries can remain quiet for centuries, stress building up slowly, then release all at once in a series of major earthquakes over a short period. A geological storm where magnitude 7 or 8 earthquakes happen not once in a lifetime but multiple times in a decade. Imagine you're a Bronze Age city already stressed by drought and trade disruptions. Then a major earthquake hits. Your palace complex, the center of administration, collapses. Your fortification walls crack and crumble. Your grain storage facilities, massive buildings full of ceramic vessels, shatter. Suddenly you've lost your government, your defenses, and your food reserves all in one catastrophic moment. You're vulnerable to raiders. You're vulnerable to famine. You're vulnerable to internal chaos as desperate people fight over whatever resources remain. One earthquake might be survivable. The palace gets rebuilt. The walls get repaired. But if earthquakes keep happening year after year, each one destroying what you've managed to rebuild, eventually you give up. You abandon the cursed city and move somewhere, anywhere else. This would explain why so many Bronze Age cities were simply abandoned rather than continuously reoccupied, why people didn't come back even after the immediate crisis passed. If you think the gods have cursed a location, if earthquakes keep destroying everything you build, you move. Simple as that. But the earthquake storm theory can't explain everything either. Some destroyed sites show clear evidence of burning, of weapons, of the kind of violent chaos that earthquakes don't cause, and earthquakes don't explain why the collapse lasted so long. An earthquake is a moment of destruction, but recovery usually begins immediately. The Bronze Age collapse lasted centuries in some regions. Something more than just earthquakes was happening. Some scholars look at the evidence differently. They see revolution. The internal rebellion hypothesis suggests that the Bronze Age collapse wasn't caused by external invaders or natural disasters, but by the people themselves rising up against oppressive palatial elites. Think about the structure of Bronze Age society. At the top, a tiny aristocracy living in massive palaces, controlling vast resources. Below them, a small class of all scribes, craftsmen, and administrators, and at the bottom, the vast majority of the population. Farmers, shepherds, labourers whose endless work supported the whole pyramid. They produced the grain, they paid the taxes, they died in the wars, and they got very little in return except the privilege of surviving under palatial protection. Now add stress. Drought reduces harvests, but the palace still demands the same taxes. Trade disruptions cut off imports, but the elite still expect luxury goods. Foreign threats require military service but offer no clear benefits. At some point, the peasants do the math. They're starving while the palace stores grain. They're dying in wars while aristocrats stay safe behind walls. They're working themselves to death while scribes sit in shade keeping records nobody but the palace cares about. Why continue? Why not burn it all down and take what's yours? The evidence for this is subtle but compelling. Many palatial centres show signs of systematic destruction from the inside. Not the kind of hasty looting you'd expect from raiders passing through, but thorough, almost ritualistic destruction. Storage rooms emptied out completely. Administrative buildings specifically targeted. Elite residential areas burned while workshop areas sometimes left intact. This looks less like invasion and more like revolution. Oppressed populations rising up, killing or driving out their rulers, taking whatever they could and burning the rest. Some texts hint at this too. Late Bronze Age archives mention social unrest, labour strikes, peasants fleeing their obligations. In the final years, Hittite kings were dealing with internal rebellions as much as external threats. The Mycenaean palaces show evidence of increasingly desperate attempts to control the population in their final decades. More fortifications built around palatial centres, as if the rulers were afraid of their own people. This theory resonates with modern sensibilities. We understand revolution. We understand oppressed populations reaching breaking points, and it explains why literacy disappeared. If literacy was a tool of palatial control, used mainly for taxation records and administrative documents, then destroying the palace means destroying the purpose of literacy. The new, more egalitarian society that emerged after the collapse didn't need scribes because they didn't have centralized administrations worth recording. But revolution theory has gaps too. If this was internal uprising, why didn't new power structures emerge immediately? Revolutions usually replace one regime with another. The Bronze Age collapse led to centuries of depopulation and simplification. That's more consistent with societal breakdown than political transformation. And some smaller sites that don't show any signs of internal stress still got destroyed. What were they rebelling against? Finally, there's the disease hypothesis. Could epidemic disease have played a role? We know pandemics can devastate complex societies. The Black Death killed a third of Europe's population and fundamentally transformed medieval civilization. The diseases brought to the Americas by European colonizers collapsed entire empires. Could something similar have happened in the Bronze Age? The evidence is frustratingly thin. Disease doesn't leave obvious archaeological traces. Ancient texts mention plagues, but describe them in vague supernatural terms. However, all the conditions for pandemic were present. Increased trade connectivity meant diseases could spread across the entire Mediterranean. Drought and famine would have weakened immune systems. Warfare and population movements would have brought together people who'd never been exposed to each other's diseases. Urban centres packed thousands of people into close quarters with poor sanitation. If a novel pathogen emerged during this period, something like smallpox or measles making its first appearance in human populations, it could have ripped through Bronze Age civilization with devastating effect, killing the specialized craftsmen, the scribes, the administrators, leaving the survivors too few to maintain complex systems. This would explain the sudden loss of specialized knowledge, including literacy. Not because people forgot, but because the people who knew how to read and write died, and there weren't enough survivors with leisure time to pass the skill on. But again, the evidence is mostly circumstantial. We haven't found mass graves that would indicate plague. We don't have biological remains showing signs of epidemic disease. The disease hypothesis remains speculative, tantalizing but unproven. So what's the answer? Increasingly, scholars embrace what's called the multi-causal synthesis, the idea that all of these factors work together, creating a perfect storm of catastrophe. The climate changed, triggering drought across the Mediterranean. The drought stressed agricultural systems and created food shortages. Food shortages led to price inflation and trade disruptions. Trade disruptions cut off supplies of tin and copper, crippling bronze production. Without bronze, military capabilities declined. Weakened militaries couldn't protect trade routes or suppress internal dissent. Some regions experienced earthquake storms that destroyed infrastructure. Others faced waves of environmental refugees who became the sea peoples. Some populations rebelled against elites who couldn't protect them anymore. Some regions experienced disease outbreaks among stressed, malnourished populations. None of these factors alone would have destroyed Bronze Age civilization. The Hittites had survived droughts before. Egypt had weathered invasions. Mycenaean kingdoms had rebuilt after earthquakes. But all of them happening together, each crisis amplifying every other crisis, created a situation where even the most sophisticated civilizations couldn't adapt fast enough. This is the lesson that echoes across time. Civilizations aren't destroyed by single causes. They're destroyed by cascading failures, by multiple stresses hitting simultaneously, by the fragility hidden inside complexity. The Bronze Age collapse shows us that interconnection is both strength and vulnerability. The trade networks that brought wealth in good times spread catastrophe in bad times. The specialization that made society efficient made it fragile. The complexity that enabled civilization's greatest achievements also created countless points where the whole system could break. We are not so different today. Picture this. It's 1100 BC. The great palaces are burning. The last scribes are fleeing with whatever tablets they can carry. The trade ships that once connected an entire world are sitting abandoned in harbours, rotting, and in the space of maybe 2 generations, maybe 3, nearly everything that made Bronze Age civilization recognizable just stops. The writing stops. The monumental building stops. The long-distance trade that had connected Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Aegean for over 500 years just evaporates. And what follows is something historians call the Mediterranean Dark Age. Not because people suddenly became stupid or primitive, but because from our perspective, looking back, it's like someone turned off the lights. The civilizations that have been documenting everything, recording every transaction, every royal decree, every diplomatic letter, they're gone. And without their records, we can barely see what happened next. For roughly 300 years, from about 1100 to 800 BC, the archaeological record gets thin, really thin. The massive palace complexes that had dominated the landscape are abandoned. The sophisticated pottery that archaeologists use to date sites becomes simpler, cruder. The population drops catastrophically. Some estimates suggest the population of Greece fell by 75% or more. 3 out of every 4 people just gone. Dead from violence, starvation, disease, or simply scattered to places where they might survive. The survivors weren't living in cities anymore. They couldn't. Cities require surplus food production, specialized labor, administrative systems to coordinate everything. When the trade networks collapsed, when the palaces fell, all of that became impossible. Instead, people reverted to what humans had been doing for most of their history. They lived in small communities, maybe 50 or 100 people, farming or herding, making what they needed to survive, and not much more. Think about what that meant for the average person living through this transition. Your grandparents might have lived in a world with massive stone palaces, where scribes recorded everything in Linear B, where ships brought exotic goods from across the known world. They might have worked specialized jobs, potters or metal workers or administrators. They understood their place in a vast hierarchical system that connected them to a king who claimed divine authority. And now you're living in a village of maybe 60 people. You farm, you raise a few animals, you make your own tools because there's nobody to trade with anymore. There are no scribes because nobody needs to record grain shipments to non-existent palaces. There are no kings because there's nothing to rule except a handful of scattered communities trying to survive. The stories about the great kingdoms might still be told around fires at night, but they're becoming myths, tales of a golden age that seems impossibly distant. This is what collapse really means, not just the dramatic burning of palaces, but the long grinding poverty that follows, the loss of knowledge, the forgetting of skills, the simplification of everything because complex systems require resources and stability that no longer exist. But here's the thing about Dark Ages. They're not actually dark. Not to the people living through them. They're struggling, sure, suffering absolutely, but they're also adapting, surviving, slowly figuring out how to build something new from the wreckage of what came before. The archaeological evidence shows us small communities maintaining themselves, generation after generation. They're making pottery, even if it's simpler than what their ancestors made. They're farming, herding, fishing, they're staying alive, and in a few places they're doing more than just surviving. The Phoenicians were the first to really bounce back. These were the descendants of the Canaanite city-states that had existed along the coast of modern-day Lebanon, places like Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. They'd been minor players during the Bronze Age, stuck between the Hittites and Egyptians, paying tribute to whoever was stronger at any given moment. But they'd had one advantage. They were coastal cities, built on maritime trade, and they'd maintained their ships and their sailing knowledge even as everything else fell apart. When the dust settled after the collapse, the Phoenicians found themselves in an interesting position. All their major competitors were gone. The Mycenaean traders who dominated the Aegean vanished. The Hittite merchants who'd controlled Anatolia destroyed. The Egyptian state monopoly on certain trade goods broken. The whole Mediterranean was suddenly open territory. And the Phoenicians, with their ships and their knowledge of sea routes, and their desperate need to find new markets for their goods, they sailed out and claimed it. Within a few generations, Phoenician trading posts and colonies were spreading across the Mediterranean. They reached Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, even the Atlantic coast of Morocco. They were trading for tin from Britain, amber from the Baltic, gold from West Africa. They became the new middlemen of the Mediterranean world, the ones who connected isolated communities that had lost the ability to reach each other directly. But their most important contribution wasn't trade, goods, it was information technology. The Phoenicians took the complex syllabic writing systems that had dominated the Bronze Age, systems like Linear B that required years of training to master, and they radically simplified them. They created what we now call the alphabet. Think about what an alphabet really is. Instead of needing hundreds or thousands of characters to represent every syllable or every word, you need maybe 22 to 30 characters that represent individual sounds. You can learn it in weeks, not years. Any merchant, any ship captain, any trader who needs to keep records can master it without dedicating their life to scribal training. The Phoenicians weren't trying to revolutionize human communication. They were just trying to make it easier for sailors to keep cargo manifests and merchants to track debts. But they accidentally created the writing system that would eventually spread to Greece, then Rome, then Europe, then the entire world. You're reading a version of it right now. This is a pattern we see again and again after major collapses. The simplifications and adaptations that survivors make often turn out to be improvements. Not immediately, not obviously, but in ways that become clear only later. The alphabet couldn't have replaced Linear B when the palaces were still functioning. The palace bureaucracies needed complex scripts that could represent their complex administrative needs. But after the collapse, when the people who needed to write were merchants and traders rather than scribes, a simple, flexible writing system was exactly what worked. Meanwhile, in the territories where the great empires had fallen, new societies were slowly forming. In the Levant, in the highlands that had been contested borderlands between Egypt and the Hittites, small tribes were consolidating. They were pastoralists mostly, herders who'd survived the collapse by staying mobile, avoiding the violence that destroyed the cities. Now they were settling down, building permanent villages, slowly developing their own identity. These were the early Israelites, and the stories they would eventually write down, stories about Exodus and conquest and covenant, carry echoes of the collapse era, stories of cities destroyed, of wandering in wilderness, of forging new societies from displaced peoples. To the east, in Mesopotamia, things had gotten complicated. The great empires of the Bronze Age had fragmented into competing kingdoms. But there was one city-state that hadn't just survived. It had been systematically building strength, even as everyone else was falling apart. Assyria. Located in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians had spent the Bronze Age as relative outsiders, sometimes vassals of more powerful neighbours, sometimes independent, always militaristic. When the collapse came, when trade routes broke down and resources became scarce, the Assyrians responded in the most direct way possible. They took what they needed by force. Over the centuries of the Dark Age, Assyria was slowly, methodically conquering its neighbours. Not in one dramatic campaign, but through generations of warfare, absorption, consolidation. They were developing something unprecedented, a true territorial empire, not just a network of tribute-paying vassals like the Bronze Age kingdoms, but an integrated administrative state that directly controlled vast territories. They were perfecting the machinery of imperial conquest. Professional armies, siege warfare, mass deportations of conquered populations, propaganda systems to terrify enemies into surrendering. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that would emerge around 900 BC would be the most powerful military force the ancient world had yet seen. Brutal, efficient, ruthless, it would dominate the Near East for the next 3 centuries. And in Greece, something else was happening. Something that would prove even more important in the long run. The Mycenaean kingdoms had been completely destroyed. The palaces were abandoned, the writing forgotten, the population scattered. But the survivors were slowly, over generations, rebuilding. Not trying to recreate what had been lost, they couldn't, but creating something new. Small independent communities, villages growing into towns. They maintained their own local governments, developed their own identities. They were separated by mountains and valleys, isolated enough that each community developed its own character, but connected enough by sea routes and trade to maintain contact with each other. These were the first Greek city-states. The polis that would eventually give us Athens and Sparta, Corinth and Thebes. They were tiny compared to the Bronze Age kingdoms, some with populations of just a few thousand. But they were developing something radically different from what had come before. They were experimenting with new forms of social organization, collective decision-making, civic participation, the idea that free citizens could have a say in how their community was governed. Not democracy yet, that would come later, but the seeds of it. The social structures that would eventually produce classical Greek civilization were being born in these small Dark Age communities precisely because the collapse had wiped away the old palace hierarchies. This is the paradox of collapse. Yes, it destroys. Yes, it causes immense suffering. Yes, whole civilizations vanish and knowledge is lost and populations decline, and for generations people live in poverty compared to what their ancestors knew. But collapse also clears away systems that had become rigid, entrenched, unable to adapt. It creates space for experimentation, for new ideas, for people who would never have had opportunities in the old system to try something different. The Bronze Age palace economies had been centralized, hierarchical, conservative. They'd worked brilliantly for centuries, but they'd also been inflexible. Power was concentrated in royal, families and palace bureaucracies. Innovation was controlled by the state. People's roles were largely determined by birth. When the system was stable, this provided security and order, but it also meant that new ideas, new technologies, new social arrangements had to work within existing power structures, or they didn't happen at all. After the collapse, after the Dark Age, the societies that emerged were more diverse, more experimental, more decentralized. The Phoenician trading networks weren't controlled by kings. They were run by merchant families making independent decisions about where to sail and what to trade. The Greek city-states weren't parts of a unified empire. They were independent communities in constant communication and competition with each other. The alphabet wasn't a state-controlled technology requiring specialized training. It was a tool anyone could learn and use. Even the brutally centralized Neo-Assyrian Empire represented innovation. The Assyrians were creating new technologies of conquest and control, new administrative systems for managing diverse populations across vast distances. Their methods were harsh, but they were also effective in ways that Bronze Age tribute systems had never been. They were solving the problem of how to build a stable territorial empire in a world without the trade networks and diplomatic systems that had held the Bronze Age world together. By 800 BC, the Dark Age was ending. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but gradually, unevenly, populations were recovering. Trade networks were reforming. Writing was spreading again, in new forms, to new people. Cities were growing, and the Mediterranean world was becoming connected again, not as a Bronze Age palace economy, but as something new. A world of independent city-states and merchant networks and competing empires. A world that would eventually give rise to classical civilizations, the ones we actually remember. The Greece of Pericles and Socrates, the Rome of Caesar and Augustus, the Persian Empire, the Hebrew Bible, Greek philosophy, Phoenician colonies spreading across the Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts. None of that could have happened without the collapse. Not because collapse is good, it's not, but because the structures that the Bronze Age had created, as impressive as they were, had reached their limits. They couldn't evolve further because they were too rigid, too centralized, too dependent on specific environmental and economic conditions. When those conditions changed, when the climate shifted and the sea peoples attacked and the trade networks failed, the whole system came apart because it couldn't bend without breaking. What rose from the ashes was more flexible, more diverse, more capable of adapting to changing conditions. The societies that emerged from the Dark Age weren't necessarily better for the people living in them, not at first, probably not for generations, but they were systems that could evolve, that could incorporate new ideas and new technologies, that could grow and change without collapsing under their own weight. The survivors of the collapse, the people who lived through those dark centuries, they didn't know they were laying foundations for classical civilization. They were just trying to survive, to feed their families, to maintain some connection to the world beyond their immediate community. But in doing so, in adapting to a world without palaces and empires, they created something new, something that would eventually become more influential, more enduring than anything the Bronze Age had produced. This is what happens after collapse. Not resurrection of what was lost, but transformation into something different. The world that emerged from 1177 BC and the Dark Age that followed wasn't the Bronze Age restored. It was something new entirely, built by people who remembered the old world only as myths, and who had to create their own solutions to the problems of survival and community and meaning. And those solutions, forged in the aftermath of total civilizational collapse, would shape the course of human history for the next 3,000 years. So here we are, at the end of our journey through 1177 BC. The year when the Bronze Age world didn't just stumble, it shattered. The Hittite Empire, gone. Mycenaean Greece, empty ruins. Ugarit, burned to ash. The great civilizations that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries all collapsed within a single generation. Some vanished so completely that we forgot they ever existed until archaeologists started digging them up 3,000 years later. Think about that for a moment. These weren't primitive societies. These were the superpowers of their age. They had writing systems, international diplomacy, sophisticated trade networks spanning thousands of miles. They built palaces that still impress us today. They created art and literature that influenced everything that came after. The Iliad and the Odyssey, the stories that defined Western literature for millennia, they're basically Bronze Age collapse survivor tales, memories of a glittering world that fell into darkness. And yet, despite all their power, all their wealth, all their achievements, they fell. Not to a single catastrophe, but to a cascade of failures that fed on each other. Climate change disrupting agriculture, earthquakes destroying cities faster than they could be rebuilt, economic networks collapsing when key trade routes failed, sea peoples and other migrants flooding across borders, not necessarily as conquerors, but as desperate refugees who overwhelm the systems designed to manage them. Each problem made the others worse. Each solution failed because the interconnected nature of Bronze Age civilization meant that weakness anywhere threatened stability everywhere. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so terrifying and so relevant. These civilizations didn't fail because they were weak or primitive. They failed because they were complex, interconnected, and dependent on systems that couldn't handle multiple simultaneous shocks. When everything worked, the system was brilliant, enabling prosperity and cultural achievement on a scale the world had never seen. But when stress points emerged, the whole network unraveled with shocking speed. Sound familiar? We live in a world more interconnected than anything Bronze Age traders could have imagined. Global supply chains move goods across oceans in days. Digital networks transmit information around the planet in seconds. Our civilization's complexity makes Bronze Age palace economies look simple by comparison, and that complexity brings the same vulnerabilities. Climate disruption, economic interdependence that transmits failures across borders, migration pressures driven by regional instability. We're not facing the Bronze Age collapse again, but we're facing the same fundamental challenge. How do you maintain stability in a complex system when multiple things start going wrong at once? The Bronze Age collapse doesn't give us easy answers. History never does. But it gives us perspective. It reminds us that civilizations we think of as eternal, as too big to fail, can disappear within a human lifetime. It shows us that the collapse of complex societies isn't always sudden and dramatic. Sometimes it's gradual, almost invisible until you're living through the consequences. And most importantly, it teaches us that resilience isn't about strength alone. Egypt survived not because it was stronger than the Hittites or wealthier than Mycenae, but because it was more self-sufficient, less dependent on the networks that failed everywhere else. But there's also hope in this story, because after the Dark Ages came the Iron Age. New civilizations rose from the ashes, learning from what had been lost. The Phoenicians took their alphabet and spread literacy across the Mediterranean. The Greeks absorbed the ruins of Mycenaean culture and built something new. The Israelites, the Aramaeans, the Neo-Assyrians, all of them rose in the aftermath, creating societies that would shape human history for millennia. Collapse isn't the end. It's a transformation, painful and chaotic, but sometimes necessary for new possibilities to emerge. And the mystery remains. We still don't know exactly what happened. We probably never will. The sea peoples might remain forever mysterious, their origins and motivations hidden in the gaps between fragmentary texts and ambiguous archaeology. We might never untangle the exact sequence of events that turned thriving Bronze Age civilization into smoking ruins. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the uncertainty is part of what makes this story so compelling. It reminds us how much we don't know, how much of human history has been lost, how many stories will never be told. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's greatest catastrophes. If you enjoyed exploring the mysteries of 1177 BC, I'd love if you could hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the ancient world. And I'm genuinely curious. Where are you listening from? Are you drifting off to sleep in New York or Sydney or somewhere I've never heard of? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If you'd like to support the channel, YouTube memberships are available, but they're totally optional. This content is for everyone, whether you're a member or not. Your time and attention are support enough. Now, let the ancient world fade into peaceful dreams. May you sleep well, surrounded by echoes of vanished empires and the whispers of civilizations that rose, flourished, and fell beneath the same stars that shine tonight. Rest easy, knowing that even when everything fell, something new eventually grew. Sweet dreams.